Maintain course and speed. Watch for contacts on the starboard side.
All hands, battle stations! Fire at will! Torpedo tubes, traverse right!
This position here, near the shoals.
Yes, I see it. We must adjust the bearing slightly to avoid the formation collapsing.
The convoy is moving too fast. We must signal the new bearing.
I cannot confirm the flagship's position through this fog.
Send the Z flag immediately. Contact bearing 090. All hands, prepare for engagement. Contact bearing 275. Prepare to engage.
January 12, 1944. A dense fog clung to the waters of the Solomon Sea, turning the horizon into a blur of gray. The Japanese destroyers patrolling the northern approaches squinted through the mist, their silhouettes barely visible, the sound of their engines muffled by the thick air. On the bridge of one ship, officers adjusted their binoculars, tension etched across their faces. Intelligence had warned of Allied movements, but nothing could prepare them for what came next. A faint ripple, almost imperceptible, moved through the fog. Then, without warning, the mist seemed to come alive. Allied destroyers, their shapes ghostly and sudden, charged forward with relentless speed. Guns rattled as sailors scrambled to respond. The Japanese crew froze, disbelief spreading faster than the fog itself. Orders were shouted, but the enemy was already among them, exploiting the very shroud that had once promised concealment. In those first heartbeats, the calm, gray expanse of sea became a theater of chaos. Every officer, every sailor, understood that the rules of engagement had shifted. The fog was no longer protection, it was a trap, and through it, death was advancing at full speed. The Japanese Navy would soon discover that this audacious charge would leave a mark on the Pacific that they could never forget. By early 1944, the Pacific theater had become a sprawling chessboard of naval power, with each fleet maneuvering for advantage across thousands of miles of open ocean. The Japanese Imperial Navy, once dominant, now faced a relentless challenge from the United States Navy, whose industrial output had begun to eclipse anything the Axis could match. Carrier groups, battleships, and destroyers moved in intricate patterns, their positions informed by reconnaissance planes, intelligence intercepts, and the ever-shifting tides of war. The Solomons, the Gilberts, and the Marshalls had already witnessed bitter encounters where Japanese forces had fought to hold strategic islands and sea lanes. By January 1944, the Allies were not only advancing through the Central Pacific, but were also perfecting the use of fast, agile ships to strike suddenly, exploiting gaps in enemy defenses. The Japanese, still relying heavily on their doctrine of decisive fleet engagements, often expected encounters in open water under clear conditions, where their larger ships and heavier guns could dominate. Fog, storms, and night attacks were considered hazards, but not the centerpiece of a strategic assault. In this environment, destroyers had emerged as vital instruments of both offense and reconnaissance. For the Americans, these fast, lightly armored vessels became weapons of surprise. Capable of speeds exceeding 30 knots, armed with torpedoes and medium-caliber guns, they could infiltrate enemy lines, strike swiftly, and vanish before heavier ships could respond. Their crews were trained to exploit visibility, or lack thereof, turning fog, smoke, and darkness into tactical allies. The Japanese Navy, conversely, had devoted more attention to battleships and carriers, vessels designed for power rather than subtlety. Destroyer tactics existed, but were often secondary in planning. Commanders relied on radar and lookouts, but fog remained an unpredictable variable. In the Solomon Sea, January mists were a constant presence, yet the Japanese often interpreted them as cover for reconnaissance rather than avenues for direct assault. Their patrols, though extensive, were structured for defense against conventional movements, not the audacious charges that would soon redefine the battle. Intelligence reports in the days leading up to the engagement indicated Allied destroyer movements, but these were scattered and incomplete. Radio intercepts hinted at fleet repositioning, but the Japanese officers, conditioned by experience in more predictable engagements, underestimated the possibility of a coordinated attack through thick fog. Ships were arranged in standard patrol formations, with lines separated enough to avoid accidental collisions, but not optimized to detect or repel an aggressive, sudden strike. As dawn approached on January 12th, the sea remained shrouded in a low-hanging gray curtain. The air was heavy with salt, fog, and the faint scent of diesel from the Japanese ship's engines. Officers conferred in hushed tones, tracking reports and adjusting courses, unaware that the very conditions they monitored would soon be weaponized against them. In the distance, small wakes hinted at movement, but whether friendly or hostile could not yet be discerned. Every decision, every miscalculation, would have consequences measured in seconds and yards of maneuvering. The stage was set. On one side, a fleet trained for conventional naval warfare. On the other, destroyers designed for speed, surprise, and precision. And in between, a fog-laden sea that would soon transform from a barrier into a conduit for chaos. The Japanese Navy, confident in its patrol, had no inkling that the coming hours would test their discipline, courage, and strategic assumptions to the limit. The days leading up to the encounter were tense, yet routine for the Japanese destroyer crews. Patrol rotations, course plotting, and equipment checks filled the hours. For many officers, the fog was a familiar companion, something to navigate carefully but not to fear. Yet, beneath the surface of this calm routine, strategic undercurrents were shifting. The Allies had begun refining tactics specifically designed to exploit Japanese expectations. Rapid destroyer strikes, coordinated torpedo runs, and the use of environmental concealment to mask approach vectors. The technological landscape further favored the attackers. By early 1944, American destroyers were increasingly equipped with radar systems capable of detecting ships beyond visual range, even in thick fog. Torpedo fire, once limited to clear daylight engagements, could now be launched with devastating precision under the cover of mist. In contrast, most Japanese destroyers still relied heavily on visual spotting and sound-based detection, which made them vulnerable to surprise attacks in low-visibility conditions. Previous encounters in the Solomons had left psychological imprints on both sides. The Japanese had endured nighttime attacks that tested their discipline and coordination, yet they still tended to overestimate their ability to control engagements. Allied destroyer squadrons, on the other hand, had learned the value of unpredictability. Their commanders emphasized speed, stealth, and exploiting the enemy's assumptions. Small, agile vessels became instruments of shock, capable of delivering concentrated damage before the larger ships of the Imperial Navy could respond effectively. On the day in question, the Japanese patrol was arranged in a standard screening formation. Destroyers moved in staggered lines, relying on lookouts and signal flags to maintain cohesion. Commanders anticipated encounters with scouting parties or isolated raiders, not a coordinated frontal charge through the fog. Meanwhile, Allied forces had meticulously charted possible Japanese patrol patterns, anticipating gaps in coverage. The fog, previously a navigational challenge, was now a tactical ally. Weather reports indicated minimal wind, meaning the fog would cling stubbornly to the water surface. Visibility was reduced to mere hundreds of meters, a dangerous but exploitable condition. In naval terms, such fog could disrupt communication, obscure sight lines, and create a sense of isolation among ships separated by a few miles. 4 Japanese crews. Each shadow or distant wake would be a source of uncertainty, a potential threat, and a reason to hesitate. Hesitation, in a moment of sudden aggression, could prove fatal. By early morning, the Japanese officers were focused on reconnaissance reports suggesting minor Allied movements in the region. Maps were scrutinized, patrol zones were verified, and orders were issued for a standard sweep. Every decision reflected conventional thinking. Avoid engagement unless provoked, maintain formation, and rely on firepower superiority. They had no reason to suspect that the Allies would exploit the fog to mount a direct, high-speed assault. Meanwhile, across the same stretch of water, American destroyers were positioning themselves with precision. Crews rehearsed maneuvering drills, torpedo targeting sequences, and communication protocols. Every officer understood the risk. A miscalculation in the fog could result in collisions or wasted opportunities. Yet, the potential payoff, a surprise strike that could disable or destroy multiple enemy ships, made the gamble worthwhile. Allied commanders trusted their training, their technology, and the audacity of their orders. The fog was no longer a nuisance. It was an instrument of attack. By the time the first ghostly silhouettes began to emerge from the mist, the stage was perfectly aligned. Japanese destroyers were patrolling according to expectation, while Allied vessels, moving like shadows, approached with deadly intent. The gap between anticipation and reality was about to be bridged in the most sudden and terrifying manner imaginable. The scene was set for confrontation. What had begun as routine patrols under the heavy fog of the Solomon Sea was about to erupt into a clash that would challenge assumptions, test courage, and redefine what it meant to navigate and survive the treacherous waters of the Pacific. The fog was not only a physical barrier, it was a psychological one. On each Japanese destroyer, officers strained to identify shapes through the dense gray, their minds racing to interpret every ripple on the water. Sailors gripped rails and braces, aware that a single misstep could mean death. In moments like these, training collided with instinct. The Japanese Navy had prepared for conventional engagements, but the sudden emergence of Allied destroyers through the fog created a crisis of perception. Fear was immediate, sharp, and contagious. Hesitation threatened to cascade through the ranks. Yet, amid the uncertainty, there were flashes of resolve. Officers barked orders with precision, trying to reassert control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond expectation. Every heartbeat mattered. Every decision could tip the balance between survival and annihilation. The Americans had understood one crucial fact. The fog was their ally. A frontal charge, normally suicidal in daylight, became a strategic tool. Destroyers moved at full speed, hugging the water's surface, their wakes faint against the mist. Formations were tight, yet flexible, allowing for rapid course adjustments while concentrating firepower on individual Japanese targets. Torpedo launchers were primed, guns calibrated, and crews trained to fire on sight. By exploiting the Japanese reliance on visual spotting, the Allied destroyers effectively transformed an environmental obstacle into a weapon. In naval warfare, surprise is often the deadliest element. Here, the fog provided concealment, disorientation, and a tactical advantage that the attackers wielded with deadly precision. Leadership is tested most acutely when plans fail. For Japanese commanders, the sudden appearance of enemy ships forced instantaneous decisions. Signals were relayed in frantic bursts. Orders overlapped, sometimes contradicting each other. Some officers chose aggressive engagement, attempting to push back the intruders with rapid gunfire, while others hesitated, waiting for confirmation or clarity that never arrived. The chaos revealed both the strength and fragility of hierarchical naval command. In contrast, American destroyer captains exercised decentralized initiative. Each ship adjusted to immediate conditions, making micro-decisions in real time, trusting training and shared objectives over centralized orders. Leadership, in this context, was as much about adaptability as authority, a lesson forged in the fog and fire of battle. Technology played a decisive role. Allied destroyers had begun to integrate radar effectively into tactical operations, allowing them to detect Japanese vessels beyond visual range, even in the dense fog. Torpedo systems, capable of long-range precision strikes, turned mere proximity into lethal opportunity. Japanese destroyers, lacking equivalent radar integration, relied on visual cues and sound detection. This technological gap amplified the effect of surprise. Guns roared, torpedoes arced through the mist, and Japanese crews struggled to locate the source of the attack until it was almost too late. The encounter demonstrated a broader lesson in naval warfare. In conditions where human perception is limited, technology can shift the balance decisively. The Japanese Navy had a culture of discipline and pride in its tactical doctrine. Yet that very confidence became a liability in the fog. Observers noted that officers initially misinterpreted the silhouettes as minor reconnaissance or scattered Allied patrols. The speed and cohesion of the attack defied expectations, causing a ripple of disbelief. Sailors experienced a sudden, almost surreal shock, shapes emerging, weapons firing from obscurity, chaos unfolding in ways that training had not fully anticipated. Shock, in this context, was not merely emotional. It was operational. It slowed responses, disrupted formations, and magnified the impact of the Allied charge. For the sailors caught in the thick mist, fear and courage coexisted in a fragile balance. Every shadow seemed a threat, every distant roar of guns a reminder of mortality. On Japanese destroyers, the fog amplified uncertainty. Orders were shouted, yet comprehension lagged behind perception. Fear slowed reactions, yet it also sharpened awareness. Instinctive responses became critical. For American crews, the adrenaline of the assault combined with training honed each movement. Every turn of the helm, every calculated salvo, reflected a calm decisiveness under extreme stress. The psychological dimension of naval warfare, often invisible in strategy charts, was laid bare. Survival demanded composure amid chaos, and bravery was measured in seconds of deliberate action rather than grand gestures. Naval warfare in the Pacific demanded ruthless pragmatism. The Americans understood that exploiting fog for a surprise attack was morally neutral in military terms, but for those on the receiving end, it felt sudden and unfair. For Japanese sailors, the ethical weight was heavier. Being caught off guard, facing near impossible odds, forced them to confront not just danger, but the dissonance between honor, preparedness, and survival. For the attackers, each torpedo launched, each gun fired, carried its own calculus of necessity and risk. The moral dimension intertwined with strategy. Effectiveness required precision, yet the human cost remained immediate and indiscriminate. The fog accentuated not just human fear, but logistical vulnerability. Japanese destroyers, operating in standard patrol formations, faced challenges in communication, maneuvering, and defensive coordination. Distance between ships, visibility constraints, and reliance on visual signals created friction that slowed reactions. American destroyers, meanwhile, optimized coordination within their squadrons. Speed was weaponized. Each vessel's movement complemented the others, allowing overlapping fields of fire and synchronized torpedo launches. In naval combat, logistics, how quickly a ship can respond, communicate, and maneuver, often determine outcomes as decisively as firepower. The fog transformed logistical limitations into operational vulnerabilities for the Japanese, while enhancing the offensive potential of the attackers. This encounter was not an isolated phenomenon. It reflected broader trends in Pacific naval warfare. By 1944, Allied forces had increasingly leveraged speed, surprise, and environmental conditions to compensate for numerical or positional disadvantages. Japanese over-reliance on doctrine and heavy ships made them vulnerable to unconventional tactics. Earlier battles, from Guadalcanal to the Solomons campaigns, had demonstrated that mobility and audacity often trumped raw firepower. The fog charge represented a culmination of these lessons, a tactical innovation that highlighted the evolving nature of maritime conflict. Naval historians later cited this engagement as a turning point in destroyer doctrine, emphasizing that adaptability and environmental exploitation could overcome traditional expectations. The fog lay heavy over the Solomon Sea as the first flashes of engagement ignited. Allied destroyers, their engines barely whispering through the mist, had closed the distance. Japanese lookouts spotted ghostly shapes too late. The ships were upon them before recognition could turn into response. On the bridge of the lead Japanese destroyer, officers shouted orders, but the words collided with the roar of engines, the hiss of gunfire, and the omnipresent fog that seemed to swallow sound as readily as sight. At precisely 7:14, torpedoes arced silently through the mist, cutting invisible lines of death toward unsuspecting Japanese vessels. Explosions ruptured the fog with sudden violence. The first Japanese destroyer lurched as a torpedo struck amidships, tearing open the hull. Alarms screamed, water surged, and crews scrambled desperately to contain flooding. The assault had begun with precision, exploiting every gap in formation. Simultaneously, Allied gunners unleashed concentrated salvos. Medium-caliber shells struck decks, superstructures, and gun emplacements. Smoke coiled upward, mingling with the fog, creating a surreal battlefield where visibility dropped to mere meters. Japanese ships attempted evasive maneuvers, but in close quarters and under sudden attack, coordination faltered. Some vessels collided, minor at first, yet enough to complicate defensive efforts and disrupt firing sequences. Amid the chaos, individual acts of skill and courage punctuated the broader devastation. Japanese gunners, operating manually, returned fire where possible, sometimes hitting enemy destroyers before being overwhelmed. Damage control parties worked feverishly, bracing bulkheads and pumping water, aware that a single lapse could doom the ship. On the attacking side, American captains adjusted in real time, issuing micro-orders to compensate for shifting targets and changing visibility. The fog, once a neutral element, had become a weaponized terrain of split-second decisions. By 7:28, the tide of engagement began to crystallize. Several Japanese destroyers were immobilized or heavily damaged, their formations broken. Allied vessels, moving in coordinated sweeps, exploited every opening. Torpedoes found their marks. Shells landed with devastating accuracy. The Japanese command structure struggled to adapt. Signals were sent, flags waved, and attempts at counter-battery fire were made. Yet the fog and the speed of the assault rendered conventional responses ineffective. The intensity of the attack escalated further. The sea itself seemed to respond, waves crashing against damaged hulls, fires consuming deck equipment, and the ever-present mist cloaking every movement. Sailors, faces streaked with soot and sweat, shouted amidst the chaos, their voices barely audible over the cacophony. The fog, the element they had relied on for cover, had transformed into a theater of sudden annihilation. Every ship that had entered the assault zone now faced either destruction or critical impairment. In those initial crucial moments, the Japanese Navy confronted the full implications of underestimating the environmental advantage of their enemy. Orders issued too late, formations disrupted, and communications delayed allowed the Allied destroyers to maintain initiative. Speed, surprise, and tactical coordination combined to create a situation from which recovery, was unlikely without significant loss. The attack demonstrated the deadly efficiency of exploiting perception, terrain, and timing simultaneously. Amid the confusion, a brief moment of clarity emerged on the Allied side. Captains and officers recognized that overextension could invite counterattack, yet the Japanese Navy's disarray allowed them to press forward with controlled aggression. The fog that had concealed their approach now protected their withdrawal. Every salvo, every torpedo was calculated not just for immediate effect, but to maintain dominance until the Japanese could regroup, a command of initiative that defined the turning point of the encounter. By the end of this opening phase, multiple Japanese destroyers were out of action, fires raged across decks, and the psychological shock among crews was profound. The Allies had seized control of the engagement within the first 20 minutes, exploiting fog, speed, and preparation to deliver maximum impact. The scene, though chaotic, revealed a singular truth. In naval warfare, when initiative is combined with tactical ingenuity and environmental mastery, surprise can decisively rewrite expectations. The devastation wrought in this initial surge set the stage for the next phase, an unfolding sequence of maneuvers, counterattacks, and calculated risks that would ultimately define the battle's decisive outcome. As the minutes stretched into half an hour, the battle intensified. The fog remained a gray, suffocating blanket, limiting visibility to mere dozens of meters. Japanese destroyers, struggling to regroup, attempted evasive maneuvers, but coordination was fragmentary. The Allied vessels exploited every opening, flanking and encircling targets with near-surgical precision. Torpedo volleys pierced the water silently, detonating with devastating concussions that sent wooden deck planks and steel fragments airborne. By 7:45, a second wave of coordinated attacks hit the Japanese formation. One destroyer, crippled but still afloat, became a focal point of fire. American guns pounded the hull, while torpedoes approached from two directions. Crew members, faces pale with fear and determination, fought desperately to maintain the ship's integrity. Flooding compartments were patched hurriedly. Wounded sailors were carried below deck. Yet the relentless pressure of the assault allowed no respite. Each attempt to stabilize the vessel was countered by new attacks, a relentless cycle of destruction and survival. The Japanese officers, now acutely aware that retreat or surrender was imminent, faced harrowing decisions. Orders conflicted with reality. Should they attempt to regroup into a defensive line, risking concentrated fire from multiple directions? Or should they scatter, hoping to escape the fog gauntlet? Chaos reigned on the bridges. Some crews panicked. Others displayed stoic resolve, maintaining rudimentary formations in the face of overwhelming odds. The dissonance between doctrine and immediate threat highlighted the psychological strain of sudden, technologically advantaged warfare. Meanwhile, American destroyers maintained cohesion. Even under fire from Japanese guns that sporadically found their mark, the attacking vessels continued their sweeping maneuvers. Radar guidance, coordinated communication, and prior reconnaissance allowed them to anticipate evasive action and adjust targeting instantaneously. This dynamic use of information and technology magnified the effectiveness of each attack, turning individual moments of chaos into a continuous, controlled offensive. By 8:15, the engagement had reached a critical turning point. Several Japanese destroyers were ablaze, hulls riddled with torpedo damage, engines failing. Smoke mixed with fog, reducing visibility further. Yet the Americans pressed on, exploiting the very confusion that had initially concealed their advance. The Japanese fleet, once confident and disciplined, was fragmented. Crews abandoned sections of their ships, attempting to save lives as much as vessels, while officers coordinated desperate counterattacks that were largely ineffective against the relentless, coordinated assault. The fog, which had concealed the American approach, now cloaked the final phase of the opening strike. Allied destroyers, having struck decisively, began a series of tactical withdrawals, repositioning to exploit remaining gaps in Japanese formations. Each movement was calculated to maximize damage while minimizing exposure to return fire. By 8:40, the initial Japanese line of defense had been shattered. Fires raged across multiple decks. Torpedoes had rendered engines and rudder systems inoperative, and the psychological impact on the crews was profound. Individual acts of valor punctuated the destruction. Japanese sailors braved burning decks to save comrades. Officers remained at posts long after rational prudence dictated abandonment. Yet the combination of speed, surprise, environmental mastery, and technological advantage had rendered the larger defensive capacity almost irrelevant. The initial shock, compounded by relentless execution, defined the decisive moment of the engagement. By 9 o'clock, it was clear which side had seized the initiative. The Japanese Navy, shocked and fragmented, could no longer mount effective resistance. Allied destroyers, though battered in places, retained operational coherence, ready to pursue further tactical opportunities or withdraw safely. In less than an hour, the dynamics of the encounter had shifted completely. The audacious charge through fog had demonstrated the lethal power of initiative, precision, and environmental exploitation. The clash left a permanent imprint, not only on the ships and crews, but on Japanese strategic thinking. Naval doctrine had been challenged. Assumptions about engagement conditions and environmental safety were shattered. The battle underscored a fundamental principle. In modern naval warfare, audacity, adaptability, and technological integration could decisively override numerical strength or traditional tactical expectations. With the immediate engagement concluded, the focus now turned to its consequences. The aftermath for the Japanese Navy, the Allied forces, and the broader course of the Pacific Campaign. The lessons learned would ripple through subsequent encounters, shaping strategy, morale, and doctrine across the theater. The morning fog began to lift, revealing the full scale of destruction. Japanese destroyers, once confident in their patrol formations, now floated crippled or burned, hull scarred by torpedoes and gunfire. Fires continued to smolder across decks, smoke mingling with the morning haze. Survivors clung to railings, rafts, or debris, faces streaked with soot and salt water, eyes wide with disbelief at the sudden reversal of fortune. For the Japanese Navy, the shock was more than tactical. It was existential. Initial reports from the engagement confirmed heavy losses. 2 destroyers were sunk outright, several others heavily damaged, and scores of sailors were killed or wounded. Communications to nearby bases relayed the scale of devastation, noting that conventional defensive strategies had failed catastrophically against a smaller but faster and better coordinated force. Officers expressed frustration and incredulity in their logs, repeatedly emphasizing the unexpected audacity of the Allied maneuver and the difficulty of responding under fog-obscured conditions. For the Allied forces, the outcome was both a tactical victory and a demonstration of doctrinal evolution. Destroyers had exploited speed, radar guidance, and the fog itself to inflict maximum damage while sustaining relatively minimal losses. Crew accounts highlight a combination of disciplined execution, adherence to training, and careful coordination under stress. The engagement reinforced confidence in environmental exploitation as a core tactical principle, validating strategies that emphasized initiative, surprise, and adaptability over brute force or sheer numbers. Strategically, the impact extended beyond the immediate encounter. The Japanese Navy recognized the vulnerability of relying on standard patrol formations and visual detection in variable conditions. Subsequent operational reports recommended revisions to engagement protocols, including increased radar integration, tighter communication lines, and contingency planning for surprise attacks in low-visibility environments. Morale among surviving crews was shaken. The psychological impact of being outmaneuvered and outgunned by a numerically smaller but tactically superior force left lasting impressions. From a broader perspective, the battle highlighted the shifting balance of naval warfare in the Pacific. Allied forces had increasingly demonstrated the ability to conduct precise, high-risk operations that leveraged speed, surprise, and environmental mastery. Japanese forces, while disciplined and experienced, were forced to confront the limits of traditional doctrine. Losses of ships and experienced crews were compounded by the realization that technological and tactical innovation could nullify numerical superiority. The engagement also provided insight into human behavior under extreme conditions. Accounts from surviving Japanese sailors describe a mixture of shock, fear, and awe at the speed and coordination of the assault. Decisions made under stress, both successful and failed, illustrated the fine line between panic and disciplined action. American crews, in contrast, reported the intense focus required to navigate the fog, maintain formation, and execute precise attacks simultaneously. The interplay of human decision-making, environmental conditions, and technology became starkly evident, a microcosm of the evolving nature of modern naval warfare. By mid-morning, the wreckage was clearly visible. Smoke rose in spirals from damaged hulls. Waterline breaches threatened to sink immobilized ships, and scattered survivors awaited rescue or regrouping orders. The battle had lasted less than an hour in its most intense phase, yet its effects would be measured for weeks in operational readiness, morale, and tactical doctrine. The Japanese Navy, stunned by the audacity and effectiveness of the Allied attack, was forced into a period of reevaluation, while the Allies gained confidence in the applicability of their new tactics across the Pacific. The consequences of this engagement were immediate, tangible, and psychologically profound. Ships were lost, crews were diminished, and the very assumptions of Japanese naval operations had been shaken. Yet, this was only the beginning of the lessons that the Pacific War would extract from the fog-choked waters where speed, precision, and daring had decisively rewritten the rules of engagement. In the days following the engagement, Japanese Naval Command conducted detailed assessments of the damage and operational failures. Reports highlighted not only the material losses, destroyers sunk, engines disabled, weapon systems destroyed, but also the critical gaps in tactical doctrine. Patrol formations that had seemed adequate in clear conditions proved disastrously vulnerable in fog, where visibility and coordination collapsed under the pressure of a sudden, coordinated assault. These findings prompted a reevaluation of defensive strategies, emphasizing flexibility, improved communication, and the need to integrate emerging technologies, such as radar, more comprehensively. The psychological toll on the Japanese Navy was equally significant. Officers expressed deep frustration over the perceived audacity of the Allied destroyers, describing the attack as unforeseen and disorienting in internal logs. Morale among surviving sailors was shaken. The speed and precision of the assault undermined confidence in conventional tactics. For many, the fog that had once offered a sense of concealment became a symbol of vulnerability. The lesson was clear. In an era where small, agile forces could leverage technology and environment to devastating effect, no formation or doctrine could be considered invulnerable. The material impact of the engagement rippled beyond the immediate loss of ships and sailors. Japanese naval strategy in the Solomons and surrounding waters shifted to emphasize greater reconnaissance, tighter patrol lines, and preemptive countermeasures against small, fast-moving enemy units. Allied commanders recognized the value of exploiting environmental conditions, leading to repeated use of fog, darkness, and weather phenomena in future operations. In this sense, The battle had strategic implications that extended far beyond the losses of a single day. Historically, this engagement exemplified a broader trend in World War II naval warfare: the ascendancy of maneuver, surprise, and technological integration over sheer firepower. The Japanese Navy, accustomed to decisive engagements dominated by battleships and carriers, was forced to confront the limits of traditional doctrine in a rapidly evolving theater. The ability of a smaller, faster force to inflict disproportionate damage through coordination and environmental mastery became a recurring theme in subsequent Pacific operations. Human stories from the aftermath underscored the cost of innovation and audacity. Japanese sailors recounted the sudden, disorienting nature of the assault, the frantic attempts to save their vessels, and the struggle to maintain order amidst chaos. Allied survivors described the tense focus required to navigate through fog while delivering precise attacks, aware that a single misstep could jeopardize the mission. The engagement was a test not only of strategy and technology, but of human endurance, courage, and adaptability. By the end of the week, the engagement had left an indelible mark on both navies. Japanese losses forced strategic recalibrations, altered patrol doctrines, and highlighted the dangers of underestimating the initiative of smaller, technologically savvy forces. For the Allies, the successful exploitation of environmental conditions and precise tactical execution reinforced confidence in their evolving naval doctrine. The fog that had shrouded the battlefield became a symbol of both vulnerability and opportunity, a lesson in the unpredictable interplay of technology, human decision-making, and the environment in modern warfare. The encounter, brief yet intense, exemplified the harsh realities of naval combat in the Pacific. It demonstrated that courage, preparation, and innovation could decisively shift outcomes, even against a numerically superior and traditionally disciplined opponent. And it foreshadowed the strategic evolution of both sides, as each learned that the sea could conceal both danger and opportunity in equal measure. The fog over the Solomon Sea had lifted, but its imprint lingered on ships, on sailors, and on the course of naval strategy. What unfolded in those tense hours was more than a clash of steel and fire. It was a testament to the evolving nature of warfare, where courage, ingenuity, and the mastery of environment could outweigh sheer numbers or traditional doctrine. The Japanese Navy had been trained for decisive fleet actions, confident in its formations and firepower. Yet the audacity of destroyers charging through the mist revealed the fragility of assumptions and the lethal potential of speed, coordination, and surprise. In many ways, the battle was a mirror of human experience under extreme conditions. Fear, shock, and hesitation existed alongside resolve, focus, and daring. Individual choices, whether to fire a torpedo, brace a bulkhead, or rescue a comrade, became defining moments, capable of tipping the balance in life and death circumstances. Technology amplified both risk and opportunity, with radar, torpedoes, and tactical planning shaping outcomes as decisively as human courage. The fog, once an obstacle, became both shield and weapon, reminding all who fought that the natural world can be as formidable as any enemy. Historically, this engagement stands as a pivotal lesson in the Pacific War. Adaptability, audacity, and environmental awareness can redefine combat. The Japanese Navy's shock was not merely tactical. It was symbolic of a broader shift in maritime warfare. Traditional doctrines, no matter how disciplined, are vulnerable to innovation. Conversely, the Allies demonstrated that daring, preparation, and precise execution could achieve disproportionate results, reshaping the battlefield in moments. As the sun rose higher over the Solomon Sea, the waters returned to a deceptive calm. Yet beneath the surface, the echoes of fire, smoke, and courage remained. This battle was not just a story of ships and sailors. It was a story of human resilience, the unforgiving logic of war, and the enduring lesson that in the chaos of conflict, those who see, act, and adapt first hold the greatest advantage. The fog had revealed the future of naval warfare, a domain where boldness and ingenuity could pierce even the thickest shroud of uncertainty.